When we think that people in the other party dislike us more than they actually do, it makes us more likely to dislike them. A key strategy for reducing political polarization is to find ways to help members of opposing political parties correct the misperceptions they have about each other. If previous research is our guide, closing the perception gap between Democrats and Republicans should be a top priority for reducing polarization. In other words, if you're hurt by the division that's taking place in our country, and you're tired of feeling misunderstood by those around you or afraid to share your beliefs and discuss your views with others, the most important thing that we can do is to work to close the perception gap, not only among us individually, but among our friends, our families, our churches, and our communities. Bale says that the social media prism, which is a particular form of the perception gap, has its most profound influence when people are not aware that it exists. In other words, those that don't know that there is a gap in their perception about other people, and that this gap shapes both their beliefs and behavior towards others, are the very ones who are the most susceptible to the damaging force caused by the perception gap. It's only when we see the perception gap at work in our own lives and in the lives of others that we can begin to close it. And for the sake of our country and our democracy, we need to begin closing that gap sooner rather than later. I don't want to end this video on a scary note, but I need to talk about what's at stake for our country. This increasing division and hostility has a trajectory, and it's not a good one. We would be foolish to think that things can continue on as they are without jeopardizing the stability of our nation. Eventually, the pressures of the force caused by the perception gap could spill out into violence and bloodshed. And if you don't believe me on that, here's some numbers that may change your mind. In late 2021, a study done by the University of Virginia found that a very sizable portion of Democrats and a majority of Republicans agree that it's time to split the country. One of the results from this poll was that the average Republican believed that there is no difference between a Democrat and a socialist, even though this poll tracked that the majority of Trump voters that they surveyed supported many of the largest proposals of Biden's infrastructure plan at the time. The poll also found that the average Democrat believes that there is no difference between a Republican and a fascist, even though some of the data points in the game that we just played a few moments ago showed that most Republicans strongly agree with Democrats that racism is still present in America and that we should make America stronger through good immigration policy. But despite these strong agreements and consensus, the poll ultimately found that over 80% of both Biden and Trump voters viewed the other party as a, quote, clear and present threat to American democracy. A report by More in Common warns of the dangers of the growing perception gap for our nation. When Democrats and Republicans believe their opponents hold extreme views, they become more threatened by each other. They start seeing each other as enemies and start believing they need to win at all costs. They make excuses for their own side cheating and breaking the rules to beat the other side. And as our public debates become more hateful, many in the exhausted majority tune out altogether. This is how countries fall into a cycle of deepening polarization and how democracies die. There is a trajectory that our nation is set on, and the stakes are severe. I love America. I love our democracy, and I don't want to see it destroyed. But I need to be very clear. The perception gap threatens to destroy American democracy. But the good news is that the perception gap can be closed. We are not helpless or powerless when it comes to letting the perception gap create and fuel division based on misunderstandings created by the perception gap. But ultimately, it's going to be up to us to work to close that gap in our lives and in our communities. And the good news, too, is that if Christians and churches can begin to see this problem in their churches and in their communities, the church has a truly incredible opportunity to make an amazing impact in our country by modeling how Jesus Christ and his gospel brings together people from every nation, background, and even political party, and unites them under his leadership. The perception gap is tearing our churches and our country apart, and the church is on the front lines of showing our communities and country a better vision and a better way of life.